My mother-in-law folded the last of my clothes into the suitcase with the particular neatness of someone who had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. She pressed the lid down, zipped it closed, and straightened up with the smooth efficiency of a person finishing a task they had rehearsed in their mind many times before the moment arrived. "That should be everything," she said. My father-in-law was standing near the front door with his arms folded. The same door I had walked through for the first time 7 years ago, nervous and hopeful, holding a bottle of wine I had agonized over in the store for 20 minutes. The same hallway where my daughter Lily had taken her first steps on a Tuesday afternoon while Thomas filmed it on his phone and laughed at the part where she sat down hard on the floor and looked surprised. The house where Thomas and I had built our life. Patricia Mitchell set my suitcase near the door and turned to face me. "This house was never yours," she said. She wasn't unkind about it. She said it the way people say true things, plainly, efficiently, without the need for decoration. It was always family property. You understand that. Richard Mitchell opened the front door. The October air came in cold. I looked at my suitcase. I looked at the hallway. I looked at the framed photograph on the wall. Thomas and me on our wedding day, the one where we were both laughing at something the photographer had said, and neither of us looked posed. I had always loved that photograph. I did not take it off the wall. I did not know what I was and was not allowed to take, and I did not trust myself to ask without the answer breaking something in me that I needed to keep whole for my daughter. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door. I walked outside. The door closed behind me. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, not driving, not crying, just sitting with the particular weight of a loss that has no bottom, the loss of a husband, and then, within 48 hours of that loss, the loss of everything he and I had built together. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. "Mrs. Mitchell," a man's voice said. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I was your husband's personal attorney." A brief pause. "There are things Thomas arranged that you need to know about. I've called an emergency reading of the will. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" I said yes before he finished the sentence. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. I had no idea that Thomas, even in death, had been one step ahead of everything. Before I tell you what happened in that room, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what country you are watching from. Now, let's begin. My name is Grace Mitchell. I am 33 years old. And the story I am about to tell you is, at its heart, not a story about a will or a house or a family that never wanted me. It is a story about a man who knew exactly who he had married and who spent 7 years quietly making sure the world would eventually know it too. I met Thomas Mitchell when I was 25 at a work conference in Atlanta where we had both been placed at the same lunch table through alphabetical seating, Mitchell and Moore, close enough. He was warm and funny and unpretentious in a way I hadn't expected from someone who had grown up with the kind of money his family had. He asked me more questions than he answered, and he listened to my responses as if they were interesting, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. We dated for 1.5 years and got married on a Saturday in May in a garden ceremony that was smaller than his parents had wanted, and exactly the size we wanted. His parents, Richard and Patricia Mitchell, had been polite to me in the beginning, the particular politeness of people who have decided to tolerate something they cannot prevent. As the months and years passed, the politeness thinned. Not into cruelty, exactly. Into a persistent, low-grade pressure, the kind that doesn't leave visible marks but never fully stops. The comments were always small. "Where did your family summer?" said with a tone that already knew the answer. Thomas's first girlfriend had such a presence, said in my presence, at a dinner table, to no one in particular. "You've made a very comfortable home here," with a faint emphasis on comfortable that made it something other than a compliment. Thomas heard all of it. I know he did, because I watched his jaw tighten and watched him change the subject and watched him choose, every single time, the path of least resistance between his parents and his wife. He was not a confrontational man. He loved his parents with a loyalty that occasionally cost me something, and I had made peace with that cost because I understood it and because the rest of him was worth it. What I did not know was that while Thomas was avoiding confrontations, he was also doing something else entirely. He was building. Thomas died on a Wednesday morning in October. He had felt unwell Tuesday evening. By midnight, we were at the hospital. By Wednesday morning, the doctors had told me what his heart had done and what it meant. And by Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room trying to understand how to tell our 4-year-old daughter that her father was not coming home. I called my own mother. I called Thomas's parents. Richard and Patricia Mitchell arrived at the hospital within 2 hours. They were composed in the way of people accustomed to managing difficult moments. Patricia held my hand once, briefly. Richard spoke to the doctors. That evening, we all went to the house Thomas and I had lived in for 5 years, in the neighborhood in North Atlanta where we had chosen to raise Lily and where we had talked, on good evenings on the back porch, about growing old. I understood that Richard and Patricia would want to be near the house, near the things that had been their sons. I understood grief takes up space. I was not prepared for what happened the following morning. I came downstairs at 7 o'clock to find Patricia in Thomas's home office, going through the filing cabinet. Not grieving. Going through. I stood in the doorway and asked, as gently as I could manage, what she was looking for. She told me she was reviewing the property records, that the house had been purchased with Mitchell family funds, and she wanted to confirm the ownership structure. I said nothing. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and thought about what was happening. By 10 o'clock, Richard had made 3 phone calls in the living room that I was not meant to hear but did. By noon, Patricia had placed a suitcase on the bed in the room Lily and I shared. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 30 hours after Thomas had died, my mother-in-law was folding my clothes into that suitcase with the neatness of someone finishing a task they had rehearsed. I left with my coat. Charles Whitmore's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta. He was a quiet man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the measured calm of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people received difficult news. He shook my hand, offered me water, and sat across from me at a desk that was clean except for a manila folder and a sealed white envelope. Thomas retained me as his personal attorney 3 years ago, he said, separate from the family's attorneys. He was very specific about that distinction. He opened the manila folder. He was also very specific, Whitmore continued, about what should happen in the event of his death, including a provision that triggered this meeting. He looked at me steadily. The provision states that if you were removed from the property at any point following his death, an emergency reading of the will was to be called within 24 hours, with all relevant parties present. He paused. I've contacted Richard and Patricia Mitchell. They'll be here in 45 minutes. I set down my water glass. He knew, I said. It wasn't a question. Whitmore's expression was carefully neutral. Thomas was a thorough man, he said. Richard and Patricia Mitchell arrived together, in the composed and confident manner of people who believe they already know what a document contains. They sat across the conference table from me. Patricia glanced at my coat on the back of my chair. Richard folded his hands on the table. Charles Whitmore opened the manila folder. He cleared his throat. He began to read. The first section covered Thomas's personal accounts, the savings, the investment portfolio, the retirement funds he had been building for 11 years. All of it directed, in full, to me, to be held in trust for Lily's future and our family's stability. Patricia's hands moved slightly on the table. Richard's expression did not change, but something behind it did. The faintest recalibration, the first intimation that this document was not what they had expected. Whitmore turned the page. The house, he read, had been restructured in its ownership 2 years earlier. Thomas had purchased his parents' original stake in the property at full market value, a transaction that had been completed quietly and cleanly through a separate legal process. The house was Thomas's, solely and completely. And Thomas's will directed it in full, to me. Patricia Mitchell made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The kind a person makes when something certain becomes uncertain so quickly the body responds before the mind catches up. Richard said, tightly, "That's not. The house has always been. The transaction is fully documented," Whitmore said, without heat. "The records are attached." He turned another page. Thomas's shares in Mitchell Real Estate Holdings, the 40% stake that had been his since the company was restructured 8 years ago, had been placed in a separate trust. The trust named a single beneficiary and decision-maker. His wife.
Me.
The room went dead silent. Richard and Patricia Mitchell sat across that table and looked at a document that told them their son had spent 3 years quietly, carefully, completely legally transforming the landscape of everything they had assumed was coming back to them. He had not done it in anger. He had not done it as punishment. He had done it because he knew his wife and he knew his parents, and he had decided 3 years ago, without drama, without confrontation, that he was not willing to leave her unprotected in a world where he might not be present to protect her himself. Whitmore set down the main document and picked up the white envelope. "There is one final item," he said. Thomas asked that a personal letter be read aloud to everyone present. No one spoke. He opened the envelope and unfolded 2 pages of Thomas's handwriting. "I will not share the full letter here.
Some things are not for sharing.
But I will tell you what Thomas wrote to his parents in the last paragraph. He wrote that he loved them, that he had always loved them, and that love had never been the question. He wrote that he had spent his marriage watching them treat his wife as a temporary presence, a circumstance to be managed rather than a person to be known. He wrote that Grace was the most genuine and steadfast person he had ever encountered, and that the years she had given him were the best years of his life, and that she had given them quietly and without asking for recognition, which was entirely like her and which he had never, not for a single day, taken for granted. He wrote, "I need you to understand that she is not someone who happened to my family. She is the reason my family existed at all." Whitmore's voice stayed steady throughout. Patricia Mitchell was crying before the second paragraph. Not the composed, managed tears of someone performing grief. The genuine, broken kind. Richard sat absolutely still with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on a point somewhere past the window. When Whitmore finished, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it across the table to me. "This belongs to you," he said. The legal process that followed took several months. Richard and Patricia contested 2 provisions of the will, which is their right, and which I understood without bitterness. The courts reviewed everything and upheld it in full. I am still in the house. Lily is in the same bedroom she has always been in, with the same window that looks out over the yard where Thomas taught her to look for fireflies in June. I became a shareholder in Mitchell Real Estate Holdings. I attend the quarterly meetings. Richard and I are professional with each other in the way that people are professional when the alternative is worse. Patricia and I have had 2 real conversations since that room. One about Lily, one about Thomas. Both were difficult. Both mattered. The photograph of Thomas and me is back on the wall. I went back for it the morning after the will reading, and Patricia did not stop me. She stood in the hallway and watched me take it off the hook and did not say a word. I think that was the closest thing to an apology she knew how to offer. I accepted it as one. People ask me sometimes what Thomas knew, what he saw coming, how far ahead he had planned. I think he saw it clearly. I think he had been watching his parents his entire life and understood them with a precision that was loving and unsentimental at the same time. He knew they would move quickly. He knew they would be confident. He knew that the window between his death and the reading of a will is exactly the kind of window that certain people move through without hesitation. So he closed the window before it ever opened. He did it without telling me. Not because he was keeping secrets, but because telling me would have meant asking me to live inside the knowledge of what he feared, and he was not willing to do that to me. He carried it alone, and he built something that would stand after he was gone. I have thought many times about what it means to be loved like that. The kind of love that is not only present and warm and visible, but that also thinks ahead. That prepares. That stands between you and what might come, even from the distance of a will read in a law office on a cold afternoon. Thomas Mitchell was a man who loved his wife the way good people build things, carefully, completely, and with attention to everything that might come after. I was lucky enough to be his wife. I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that document.